Greetings and salutations, everybody. Welcome to a different kind of video here. I figured I would slot this in on a Wednesday, as it isn't about an 80s film, and it isn't just about one film, The Last Video Store, because there are two topics for this one film and one podcast episode. Now, first up, for The Last Video Store from 2023, I had heard mention of this from the creators of the film on a podcast, decided to track down the film. I got 15 minutes in and wasn't really into it. Then I realized I was watching the wrong film, a completely different film, because there were two by the same name that came out the same year. I had actually queued up a comedy which wasn't really holding my attention. So I'd actually track down the right one and rent the one that they were talking about, which is one created by Cody Kennedy and Tim Rutherford, starring Kevin Martin, Matthew Kennedy, and Yaya Adams, with Cody, Tim, and Kevin having been the guests on the podcast. So when it comes to that film, I will say this is an explosion of pseudo-nostalgic kind of fun. I say that because there were films referenced in it which don't exist, but are instead kind of like parodies of many films that were in rotation and rental stores from the late 70s, especially throughout the 80s, and some into the 90s as well. So it was nostalgic in the kind of film, but not the films themselves. I think perhaps the only real film that I saw a reference to in this was a poster for Peachy Psycho Gorman, which I think there's a connection between those two films as far as how some of the effects were done or who was working on those. But anyways, what's the synopsis, since I should probably bring that in at some point here? It states, a young woman who is unknowingly in possession of a legendary cursed tape takes a collection of old VHS tapes to a video store. She and the store owner reawake its curse, which leads to the release of a raft of cinematic villains. Now, this will be kind of quick, because there is more I want to fit in toward the end, as I'd also listened to a Flightless Bird episode of their podcast about Blockbuster, which, well, I'll get to that at the end. But anyways, the basic setup is that this young woman is returning these tapes, and when they're kind of being checked, rewound, and so forth, one of them kind of acts like almost like a Jumanji-inspired plot device, in that it's having portions of those videos coming to life within the real world, and now they're trapped in a store with them. We have like an action star coming to life, a horror icon, which is definitely my favorite of these, as they mention a lot of specifics for this icon, which go well along in line with like the Friday the 13th franchise, even referencing some very specifics about the sequels. They even get a 90s bad CG monster, which comes out as a 90s bad CG monster in the video store with them. Not bad in how it was created for this film, but bad because it's supposed to be a bad one from the 90s when they're shoving CG into just about everything. So as they're kind of trapped in the store, they need to try to find a way to kind of like survive what they're being continually confronted with. Now that may sound a little bit basic, which, okay, maybe it is, but this one really does shine. For a couple of reasons. First one being the performances. Yaya does a great job in this, playing an understandably out-of-touch younger character, not being familiar with or even having any real interest in video stores, simply returning these films for her father. Now, from what I hear, she's more known for like her comedic roles, but she really balances that fish out of water / being out of touch regarding these video stores kind of character. She does it very well and has some great chemistry with Kevin, who also does a great job. So I've seen roles like Kevin's turned into a caricature before. This over-the-top, super nerdy, geeky film aficionado. Funny, but unrelatable and even quite annoying. But in this case, he really comes across as more passionate and knowledgeable than anything else. So I was completely on board with this duo trying to survive the night and kind of fix this situation that they're in this small enclosed space in this video store. And the second reason I really enjoyed this one is the nostalgia factor. This has a real sweet spot of what video stores would often be back in the day. Having a limited collection to pick from, you would often sometimes also go by employee suggestions. If you saw my video on the Prowler, this was a podcast episode where I mentioned they had the conversation come up about somebody wanting Scream 2, it being out, and somebody recommending the Prowler and then them loving it. This film really brought a lot of those feelings back, as it was a smaller store, it was more niche, the kind that would often have some new releases but not many copies, so often you would fall back onto a title you never heard of, maybe looks weird or even bad, or you go simply by the VHS or later DVD cover as the guide. Now at the time of this video, The Last Video Store is from 2023, is available on paid rental, and I feel it was definitely worth checking out. But before I move on to the end, as I normally do that right when I say checking out, just have a little bit here about Flightless Bird as well. Now, This is a podcast by journalist and documentarian David Farrier, kicked off by his time stranded in the U.S. during COVID. Unable to return to New Zealand, he started this podcast under the umbrella of the Armchair Expert podcast with Dax Shepard and Monica Padman. After some changes in the format, he and one of the producers, Rob, kind of separated out on their own to do this as like a standalone podcast with a lot more involvement from Rob directly. Now, their dynamic works really great because originally, though it was focusing only on United States versus New Zealand, those differences between the two being the main topic, occasionally there would be an episode which there isn't that much of a difference, but the topic works really well for the audience, such as this recent one about emo music and this other recent one about Blockbuster. So I finally did bring it back around there. So this episode had them interviewing employees at the Last Blockbuster in Bend, Oregon, and speaking of their history of rentals, stores versus streaming, and physical media collecting, including CDs and vinyl toward the end. Both of these hosts of this podcast are easily a lot younger than me, and they reference DVD rentals a lot more than VHS, but the talk about the rental experience was very similar, both streaming and in-store. The idea of walking in, kind of working your way around that store, looking for something that stands out, stumbling across other titles, and even building up a collection as streaming, whether music or film or television, is a different beast for so many. You know, Rob mentions having music on an iPod for a while because it was very important for him to have his collection with him rather than streaming. This is something I still do, keeping my entire collection on my phone, as I usually only stream podcasts. David mentions his DVD collections that he had created, which he still has in storage, and it is as he doesn't really like the idea of buying something digitally on a service that would possibly shut down one day, or even wanting to rent something or stream it on a service you already have, only to discover it isn't available anywhere. This is something that I feel very strongly about, especially getting into revisiting some old horror films or finally checking out ones I hadn't seen before. There are a lot of titles which just aren't out there, or they're really difficult to find. You know, if we had video stores, the only reason that a film would ever vanish from a store is through theft or destruction, or them just needing the real estate for some other titles. Because I can't really think of any other reason why they would be removed. Because I remember renting old banged up VHS tapes back in the day with these sun-bleached cases from being too close to the window. They would hang on to them as long as people would rent them every now and then. But most importantly on this episode, something that I definitely feel is that idea of choice paralysis. This choice overload that happens on streaming. Like them, many times I would be scrolling, trying to find something to watch, and even just run out of having enough time to even watch a movie that night because I couldn't decide. You know, though having tens of thousands of films to choose from anywhere which has an internet connection seems like a great idea, so often I just can't decide. Walking into a video store, you know, I would be limited, but if I couldn't decide, there were often employee recommendations, either from the employee directly or, as you know, as mentioned in the video for the Prowler, or like a specific rack of employee recommendations. But to sum it all up after this long and very rambling video, the last video store and this Blockbuster episode of Flightless Bird brought me down this nostalgic road, which was a real treat. You know, I know that there isn't really enough reason to bring rental stores back to the forefront, as even Redbox finally folded. The technology has transformed rentals where the masses are kind of fine with how they enjoy their film and television these days. And those who would enjoy this service or are lucky enough to be in an area which has a shop here and there, it's a pretty small market. But this film and this podcast, especially if you finally remember those days of renting, were more than worth checking out. And speaking of checking out, thanks for checking out my latest video here for a film and a podcast, kind of a vlog in some ways for the last video store from 2023, which is available on paid rental. This is the one by filmmakers Cody Kennedy and Tim Rutherford, so don't get it mixed up with the other one. And also the Blockbuster episode of Flightless Bird, which is on Spotify and most other platforms from what I understand. They even have a video version of it, so I will link to that at the end of this video if you want to check that one out, so stick around. And as always, thanks for coming by, and if you enjoyed, please give me a thumbs up, and if not already subscribed, consider subscribing and hitting that little bell icon to get notifications when I put up new content, which is 1 to 3 times a week, and I will see you in the next one.